they'll vote guilty or not guilty as required by Rule 23 of the Senate Rules of Impeachment. Article 1, Section 3, Clause 6 of the Constitution, regarding the vote required for conviction on impeachment, provides that, quote, no person shall be convicted without the concurrence of 2/3 of the members present, close quote. The question is on the article of impeachment. Senators, how say you? Is the respondent Donald J Trump guilty or not guilty? A roll call vote is required, and the clerk will call the roll.
Ms. Baldwin. Guilty. Ms. Baldwin, guilty. Mr. Barrasso. Mr. Barrasso, not guilty. Mr. Bennett. Mr. Bennett, guilty. Mrs. Blackburn. Not guilty. Mrs. Blackburn, not guilty. Mr. Blumenthal. No. Mr. Blumenthal, guilty. Mr. Blunt. Not guilty. Mr. Blunt, not guilty. Mr. Booker. Guilty. Mr. Booker, guilty. Mr. Bozeman. Not guilty. Mr. Bozeman, not guilty. Mr. Braun. Not guilty. Mr. Braun, not guilty. Mr. Brown. Guilty. Mr. Brown, guilty. Mr. Burr. Guilty. Mr. Burr, guilty. Ms. Cantwell. Guilty. Ms. Cantwell, guilty. Mrs. Capito. Not guilty. Mrs. Capito, not guilty. Mr. Cardin. Guilty. Mr. Cardin, guilty. Mr. Carper. Guilty. Mr. Carper, guilty. Mr. Casey. Guilty. Mr. Casey, guilty. Mr. Cassidy. Guilty. Mr. Cassidy, guilty. Ms. Collins. Guilty. Ms. Collins, guilty. Mr. Coons. Guilty. Mr. Coons, guilty. Mr. Cornyn. Not guilty. Mr. Cornyn, not guilty. Ms. Cortez Masto. Guilty. Ms. Cortez Masto, guilty. Mr. Cotton. Not guilty. Mr. Cotton, not guilty. Mr. Kramer. Not guilty. Mr. Kramer, not guilty. Mr. Crapo. Not guilty. Mr. Crapo, not guilty. Mr. Cruz. Not guilty. Mr. Cruz, not guilty. Mr. Daines. Not guilty. Mr. Daines, not guilty. Ms. Duckworth. Guilty. Ms. Duckworth, guilty. Mr. Durbin. Guilty. Mr. Durbin, guilty. Ms. Ernst. Not guilty. Ms. Ernst, not guilty. Mrs. Feinstein. Guilty. Mrs. Feinstein, guilty. Mrs. Fisher. Not guilty. Mrs. Fisher, not guilty. Mrs. Gillibrand. Guilty. Mrs. Gillibrand, guilty. Mr. Graham. Not guilty. Mr. Graham, not guilty. Mr. Grassley. Not guilty. Mr. Grassley, not guilty. Mr. Haggerty. Not guilty. Mr. Haggerty, not guilty. Ms. Hassan. Guilty. Ms. Hassan, guilty. Mr. Hawley. Not guilty. Mr. Hawley, not guilty. Mr. Heinrich. Guilty. Mr. Heinrich, guilty. Mr. Hickenlooper. Guilty. Mr. Hickenlooper, guilty. Ms. Hirono. Guilty. Ms. Hirono, guilty. Mr. Hoven. Not guilty. Mr. Hoven, not guilty. Mrs. Hyde-Smith.
Not guilty.
Mrs. Hyde-Smith, not guilty. Mr. Inhofe. Mr. Inhofe, not guilty. Mr. Johnson.
Not guilty.
Mr. Johnson, not guilty. Mr. Kane.
Guilty.
Mr. Kane, guilty. Mr. Kelly.
Guilty.
Mr. Kelly, guilty. Mr. Kennedy.
Not guilty.
Mr. Kennedy, not guilty. Mr. King.
Guilty.
Mr. King, guilty. Ms. Klobuchar.
Guilty.
Ms. Klobuchar, guilty. Mr. Langford.
Not guilty.
Mr. Langford, not guilty. Mr. Leahy.
Guilty.
Mr. Leahy, guilty. Mr. Lee.
Not guilty.
Mr. Lee, not guilty. Mr. Lujan.
Guilty.
Mr. Lujan, guilty. Ms. Lummis.
Not guilty.
Ms. Lummis, not guilty. Mr. Manchin.
Guilty.
Mr. Manchin, guilty. Mr. Markey.
Guilty.
Mr. Markey, guilty. Mr. Marshall.
Not guilty.
Mr. Marshall, not guilty. Mr. McConnell.
Not guilty.
Mr. McConnell, not guilty. Mr. Menendez.
Guilty.
Mr. Menendez, guilty. Mr. Merkley.
Guilty.
Mr. Merkley, guilty. Mr. Moran. Mr. Moran, not guilty. Ms. Murkowski.
Guilty.
Ms. Murkowski, guilty. Mr. Murphy.
Guilty.
Mr. Murphy, guilty. Mrs. Murray. Mrs. Murray, guilty. Mr. Ossoff.
Guilty.
Mr. Ossoff, guilty. Mr. Padilla.
Guilty.
Mr. Padilla, guilty. Mr. Paul.
Not guilty.
Mr. Paul, not guilty. Mr. Peters.
Guilty.
Mr. Peters, guilty. Mr. Portman.
Not guilty.
Mr. Portman, not guilty. Mr. Reed.
Guilty.
Mr. Reed, guilty. Mr. Risch.
Not guilty.
Mr. Risch, not guilty. Mr. Romney.
Guilty.
Mr. Romney, guilty. Ms. Rosen.
Guilty.
Ms. Rosen, guilty. Mr. Rounds.
Not guilty.
Mr. Rounds, not guilty. Mr. Rubio.
Not guilty.
Mr. Rubio, not guilty. Mr. Sanders.
Guilty.
Mr. Sanders, guilty. Mr. Sass.
Guilty.
Mr. Sass, guilty. Mr. Schatz.
Guilty.
Mr. Schatz, guilty. Mr. Schumer.
Guilty.
Mr. Schumer, guilty. Mr. Scott of Florida.
Not guilty.
Mr. Scott of Florida, not guilty. Mr. Scott of South Carolina.
Not guilty.
Mr. Scott of South Carolina, not guilty. Mrs. Shaheen. Mrs. Shaheen, guilty. Mr. Shelby.
Not guilty.
Mr. Shelby, not guilty. Ms. Sinema.
Guilty.
Ms. Sinema, guilty. Ms. Smith.
Guilty.
Ms. Smith, guilty. Ms. Stabenow.
Guilty.
Ms. Stabenow, guilty. Mr. Sullivan.
Not guilty.
Mr. Sullivan, not guilty. Mr. Tester. Mr. Tester, guilty. Mr. Thune. Mr. Thune, not guilty. Mr. Tillis. Mr. Tillis, not guilty. Mr. Toomey.
Guilty.
Mr. Toomey, guilty. Mr. Tuberville.
Not guilty.
Mr. Tuberville, not guilty. Mr. Van Hollen.
Guilty.
Mr. Van Hollen, guilty. Mr. Warner.
Guilty.
Mr. Warner, guilty. Mr. Warnock.
Guilty.
Mr. Warnock, guilty. Ms. Warren.
Guilty.
Ms. Warren, guilty. Mr. Whitehouse.
Guilty.
Mr. Whitehouse, guilty. Mr. Wicker. Mr. Wicker, not guilty. Mr. Wyden. Mr. Wyden, guilty. Mr. Young.
Not guilty.
Mr. Young, not guilty.
Okay, the vote unofficial right now, 57-43-7, Republicans voting guilty. But it appears that the measure will fall short again, keeping in mind the requirement of 2/3 of those present.
The yeas are 57. The nays are 43. 2/3 of the senators present not having voted guilty. The Senate judges that the respondent, Donald J Trump, former President of the United States, is not guilty as charged in the article of impeachment. The presiding officer directs judgment to be entered in accordance with the judgment of the Senate as follows. The Senate, having tried Donald J Trump, former President of the United States, upon one article of impeachment exhibited against him by the House of Representatives, and 2/3 of the senators present not having found him guilty of the charge contained therein, it is therefore ordered and adjudged that the said Donald J Trump be, and he is hereby acquitted of the charge in said article.